Hi, I'm Ken, and welcome to my channel Endurance Sweat, where it's all about training hard and having fun. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to consider subscribing and clicking on that notification bell. It makes a big difference to the channel. Okay, let's get right to it. One of the Endurance Sweat channel subscribers asked about drafting on Zwift, and so I'm glad to oblige by putting together this comprehensive guide to drafting on Zwift. First, let's talk about drafting in real life. You ride behind other riders who break the wind for you, and you conserve a lot of energy, 10 to 30% and even more. It depends on the speed that you're riding at, the gap to the rider in front of you, your position laterally if you're right behind or to the side, the number of riders, the more draft you get, and yes, even the size of riders. You get a bigger draft behind a bigger rider. When you're drafting in real life, when you come up behind other riders, you immediately feel the reduced resistance. And then you hold your position behind other riders by adjusting your pedaling force, speeding up or reducing your cadence or changing gears. And you can touch your brakes, coast a bit, or even sit taller to control that gap. And then you can steer to control the lateral position, to get right in behind or just move off to the side if you want a little more resistance, because you're getting too close. But again, you immediately feel that reduced resistance when you're drafting in real life. Now, it's similar in Zwift. When you ride behind other riders, they break the wind for you. Figuratively, of course. And you conserve energy, 10 to 30% and even more, depending on the speed and the number of riders ahead of you. Now, just like in real life, you can control your gap by modulating your pedaling force, by changing your cadence or changing gears. But then there are some substantial differences to drafting on Zwift that make it much more challenging. First of all, there's no change in resistance when you come up behind other riders. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. You cannot brake, you cannot coast, or sit taller to control the gap. In fact, if you coast, it's like putting on the brakes. And you cannot steer to adjust your lateral position. And then there's another factor, a delayed response. What you do doesn't happen immediately on Zwift due to latency, and that is due to the speed of your connection to the Zwift server. There's a fundamental, though subtle, difference between drafting in real life and on Zwift. In real life, when you come up behind other riders, you'll feel that reduction in resistance, and so you'll intuitively back off on your power to hold that gap. But on Zwift, when you come into the draft of other riders, the resistance doesn't change. So you don't get that feedback. You're inclined to keep putting out that same power and gaining speed. So you've just got to use the visual clues to back off your power input so you can hold that gap and don't overtake the riders. I really needed to give this some long thought to internalize the concept. But once you do, it's really helpful for learning how to draft on Zwift. Here are some drafting basics on Zwift. You're in the draft when you're within 5 meters of the rider or riders in front of you. If you're riding behind a single rider at around 35 kilometers an hour, the reduction in aerodynamic resistance is about 25%. And it's more when you're riding behind multiple riders, more than 30%. And the draft effect is the same whether you're riding 1 meter behind a rider or 5 meters behind a rider. The draft effect is the same. But you do get more draft effect if you're riding behind more riders. Now, to draft effectively, you have to depend on visual clues. So just look at how close you are to the rider in front of you. If the gap gets too big, you'll get the message, close the gap. To know whether you're in the draft or not, look at your avatar. When you're not drafting, you'll be down on the drops. But when you're in the draft, you'll be on the hoods. So a rider sits up on the hoods while drafting, and a rider is on the drops while not drafting. Here's a good picture of what I'm talking about. The rider in front is not drafting. That rider is on the drops. And the rider behind is in the draft. And so that rider is on the hoods. Now, I'm going to stop talking about drafting for a moment and just talk about whether you're on the drops or on the hoods when you're riding alone on Zwift. So when you're riding solo and you're not drafting, You'll be on the hoods until the speed increases to more than 33 kilometers an hour. And then once you get to 33 kilometers an hour, you'll stay on the drops until the speed decreases to 29 kilometers or less. If you do get in someone's draft, you'll be on the hoods at all times. So here's a video to illustrate what I was talking about. The lead rider is not drafting. That rider is on the drops, and he's riding at 34 kilometers an hour. Now let's watch when the rider behind goes in front. You can see that rider now is on the drops, and the rider behind sits up on the hoods. And here's a view from the side. The rider was in the draft, so he was on the hoods, and now he's moved to the side and up front, so he's on the drops. And the rider from behind overtakes the rider in front and sits up on the hoods. And now we'll have a look from behind. The rider was up the front on the drops, and the rider from behind overtakes and gets in the draft and sits up. This is a little interesting clip. Let's watch the dynamic of these riders. Now let's see if he can get in the draft. He can't move over to the side because he's beside another rider. So he's out of the draft. Now he falls behind, and Zwift moves him over to the side, and he's able to sit up on the hoods and get into the draft. As he sped up, Zwift moved him to the inside and put him out of the draft. Then the other rider moves ahead. There's a lateral gap on the side. Zwift moved him over, and he's back into the draft. So you can help yourself moving in and out of the draft by speeding up and slowing down a bit to look for those lateral gaps to get in behind other riders. Now, I mentioned the latency effect earlier. It's the lag in the connection from your computer to the Zwift server. So when you're riding on Zwift, there's a delayed response to your increases and decreases in power. It impairs your sensory feedback. When you're coming up behind other riders, to get in their draft, you actually have to ease up earlier than the visual cues that you're seeing. It just makes drafting on Zwift that much trickier. Now, to compensate for latency, Zwift uses something many people call sticky draft or draft lock, and it compensates for the latency. You stay in the draft for a range of power, or what I've seen called a wattage window. But some people complain about that because you may need a short burst of power to jump out of the sticky draft and overtake the rider in front of you. Let's watch a video clip to illustrate what I'm talking about. So now you can see I'm drafting the rider in front. I'm riding at 2 and 1.7 and 1.8 watts per kilogram while he's riding at 2.7. And now to get past, I've increased my watts per kilogram to 3.2, 3.3 watts per kilogram to get past him. So there's an illustration of sticky draft. You have this wattage range where you can sit on a rider's wheel, but then to get past, you've got to have a surge in power to overcome that sticky draft to move ahead in front again. Here are some Zwift drafting tips. To start drafting, find some riders close to your speed. Get into their draft. Perhaps they're going a little bit faster than you were, and now you can go faster for the same effort. Or you can conserve energy by going at more or less the same speed you were going previously for less power. When you are approaching those riders, close that last bit of gap gradually. Ease up. In fact, because of latency, you might need to ease up early. Else, you might find you get on their wheel and then you get a slingshot effect. As the resistance decreases because of their draft, you'll power right past them. You'll need to pay very close attention, concentrate, and this becomes particularly tricky on rolling hills. Use view number 1 or view number 3, which is the first person point of view, which is the view that you would have when you were riding in real life. Pay particular attention to the watts per kilogram of the riders that you're drafting. They can give you a good clue of what power you need to be putting out, just slightly less than what they're riding at. If you're riding in a pack of several riders, I suggest that you stay in the top 2/3 of that pack, toward the front or the middle. If you're staying right at the back, why? You risk getting gapped and losing the draft, and then it can be quite hard to catch back on. Here are a couple of screenshots of view number 1 and number 3 that I was just talking about. View number 1 is the default view in Zwift. View number 3 is the first person point of view. It's the view that you would have if you were riding in real life. View number 3 can be quite useful if you're drafting off a single rider. It gives you very good visual feedback of the gap to the rider whom you are drafting. So in this video clip, I'm just showing you views number 1 and number 3 for comparison. View number 1, the default view in Zwift. And view number 3 again. It simulates quite well riding in real life while you're drafting. Here's another tip for drafting on Zwift. If you're riding in a big pack, if Zwift moves you out to the side so you lose draft, just hold your position and Zwift will eventually move you back into the draft. And like anything else, practice really helps. So ahead of an important race or an event, practice, practice, practice. Ride with pace partners or draft other riders on solo rides. In either case, I suggest you start with flat routes, for example, Tempest Fugit, and then move on to routes through Titan's Grove, which has a lot of rollers. The Sand and Sequoias route would be an excellent choice. It can be a real challenge to draft through Titan's Grove. And something I want to mention that you might have heard about, double draft. And the name explains exactly what it is. The draft effect is doubled for some events, for some group rides and races. And the choice to use double draft is up to the ride or race organizer. With double draft, the peloton moves faster, but it's easier to get dropped and very hard to get back on. So it requires your very, very close attention when an event, race, or ride has double draft. But you will move along. And just a special note, there is no draft when you're riding on a time trial bike, but you can draft a rider on a time trial bike. Similarly, there is no draft on workouts, but again, you can draft a rider that's doing a workout. So summarizing, drafting on Zwift is similar to drafting in real life. You ride behind other riders who break the wind for you, and you can conserve a lot of energy, 10 to 30% and even more, depending on the speed and the number of riders. But there are some things that are different that can make it more challenging than in real life. You can't use your brakes, you can't coast, you can't steer to fine-tune your position behind the other rider. It can be time-consuming to become a proficient drafter on Zwift, but definitely worth practicing for significant energy savings. And like I say, you have to train hard to have fun.